The recollection from his great-grandmother. Okay, so
Accent?
the recollections of my great-great-grandmother go back to 1829. She grew up in East Prussia. My darling little girl, she writes to her grandchild, my grandmother. When I sent you this letter, a letter this past summer with recollections of our old home, you wrote to say you would like it if I wrote down some of the stories I told you from my childhood. Well, my earliest conscious memory dates back to my 3rd year. I think the year must have been 1829. I seem to see myself in our drawing room in Schloss Gilgenberg.
Was he born in 1820?
No, this is like a letter from his great-grandmother.
Okay, because he
writing to his grandmother.
If he was in...
He was born in 1942.
Yeah, we discussed that earlier. I don't remember that.
Okay, so now this is his great-grandmother recalling her childhood in Schloss Gilgenberg. My mother, whose features are no longer present to me, is sitting in a chair at her sewing table, busy with some handicraft in a window niche. The windows were some way off the ground. I clambered up into the niche and then onto the chair, standing behind my mother in my girlish way. I try to arrange and stroke her hair. Then the day comes that I seem to see before me still, and that I will never forget. I am in Mother's bedroom. It's morning. She has her quilt. She has quit her bed and is lying on the sofa. I am playing beside her. There must be someone else in the room as well, because I can hear the words. She's lost consciousness again, and I hear a call for help, and the servants come back, and they pick her up, and they carry her back to bed. Then I hear another call. Bring a warming pan for her feet. The feet were rubbed and warmed, but it was no good. They would not be warm again. I was, as I later heard, the first time she had left her bed after the birth of my baby brother. The baby was stillborn, and I remember I was called in to look at him. Father's estates, she writes, talking about the time when she was 6 or 7 years old, with their large forests, were home to many wild animals. Wild boar dwelt in the great oak forests, and even a number of wolves. Sometimes, when we rode through the forest in the evening, the horses became nervous, and if you looked about you, you might see a pair of green eyes glinting in the undergrowth. Every year there was a great wolf hunt. The government had offered a bounty for every wolf that was shot. As long as there were wolves, there were also cubs. The foresters on their forays would sometimes come upon a wolf's lair with cubs, while the old ones were away in the night hunting for food, and the foresters would pick up the cubs and put them in a sack and empty them out in our room, where we children would jump about for joy and play with the babies and tease them until they howled. It ended with their death. Their ears and claws were attached to a piece of card, and when this was sent to the government with a claim, the reward was paid out. The wolves were so bold, and they would sometimes come into our grounds and take a goose or sheep from the herd. My pet goat, to whom I was very close, suffered such a fate. The herdsmen were able, by shouting and with their dog, to scare the wolf away, but the poor beast had already had its throat bitten through. Since horses and cattle were pastured in the summer nights, Particular measures had to be taken against the wolves then. When the beasts came in the evenings, they would be smeared with an evil-smelling oil, which was called French oil, that was supposed to put off the wolves. The cattle got it on their heads and between their horns, and since that was how they defended themselves, putting their posteriors together. And with the horses, it was the tails and the hindquarters that were imbricated, because they put their heads together and used their hooves to try to keep away the wolves. Even then, I remember a horse being shown us one morning with its hindquarters so badly lacerated that it had to be put down. End quote. To me, the burger farm in Shrang, left in Sachrang? I don't know how to say this one.
What is it spelled like?
Sachrang. So Sachrang, I don't know.
Sachrang.
Good enough. It felt similarly idyllic and equally fraught. In my case, this was brought on by the catastrophes, the turbulence, and the streams of refugees of the Second World War. Before I started going to school, I remember that my brother Till and I were set to mind the cows on the Lang farm. We boys were friends with young Eckhart Lang, whom we called the Butter, because his brutal father always made him churn the butter. Minding the cows brought us our first income. It was next to nothing, but it reinforced our sense of independence. It's even possible that we earned money earlier than that, when, at the same age, we lugged beer and lemonade up the Giegelstein with the draft pony. We fixed a crate of beer to one side and a crate of lemonade to the other, and climbed almost at a trot up to the alpine meadow above the Priener Hütte. The difference in height from Sachrang is about 800 meters, and we were barefoot because in the summer we didn't wear shoes. There were shoes only in autumn and in winter until the end of April, and in the months without an R, May, June, July, and August, we didn't have underwear under our lederhosen either. Today, there's a road going up the mountains, but back then we scampered up a rocky path, and even so, we got there in an hour and a quarter. Present-day tours take 4 hours. By the alpine meadow lived a family of cheesemakers, among them a young woman named Mari. She was only one of all of them who lived up there the year round, and the story went that she would have nothing to do with the valley and the people down there, since she had once fallen in love and been deserted by someone. When she was just 1 year old, her father had stuffed her in a rucksack and carried her up the mountain, and she had grown up there. She had been down to the valley only once in her 60 years of adulthood, because her signature was required for something. I think it was for pension payments. A few years ago, shortly before her death, I ran into her in the mountain with my younger son Simon. She was past 90 and wild-looking and unkempt, even though there were people looking after her. Young men from the mountain rescue service who had a hut nearby looked in on her most days. One of them would occasionally run a comb through her hair, and it did her good to have a strong young man fixing her hair. She stuck it out up there, summer and winter, rain and storms. Not long before my visit, her hut was buried under a great avalanche, and the mountain rescue service dug a tunnel perpendicularly down for several meters until they were able to pull out Mari from the almost undamaged stone hut. And when I saw her, a heating system that would switch itself on and off automatically had just been installed in her new hut by a wonderfully devoted man, because once Mari had been found half frozen in her bed, and on another occasion she had almost set herself alight with a twig fire. The local authorities in Ashau held detailed discussions about putting her in a home, but she steadfastly refused to go, and finally decided to let her die where she had always lived. Mari dimly remembered the two boys who 70 years earlier had kept coming up the mountain with the Haflinger draft pony. Sometimes when the weather was bad, my brother and I slept in the hay barn up on the mountain and set off very early in the morning, because we had to return the horse and collect our 50 pennings before running to school. Because the way up the Alp had sharp stones that were often hidden under bunches of grass, our feet were always bloodied and sore. In summer, plagued by thirst, we once forced our way into the cowshed on the Schreckalm, and my brother approached a cow to milk her. It was a young heifer, and she gave him such a kick that he came flying out backward. From my time in Sachrang, I can still milk a cow and recognize the others who can as well, just as you can sometimes identify a lawyer or a butcher. My knowledge of milking came in handy many years later with the astronauts who made up the crew of one of the space shuttles. The background there was my fascination with the unmanned mission to Jupiter, which was proving incredibly difficult, had many reverses. The Galileo space probe was finally fired into deep space in 1989 after numerous delays and changes of plan. To attain the necessary velocity, the probe had to be sent around Venus and twice around the Earth, the gravitational pull of both planets producing a kind of a sling effect. The undertaking took all of 14 years, and at the end of the mission, with the probe almost out of fuel, NASA made the decision in 2003 to steer it with the last of its power around one of the moons of Jupiter and then expose it to the gravity of the giant planet. In order not to contaminate the moon, Europa, which is covered over with a thick sheet of ice with a presumably liquid ocean below and possibly forms of microbial life, Galileo was sent into the gaseous atmosphere of Jupiter to burn up as ultra-heated plasma. Almost all the scientists and technicians who had been engaged in the project assembled for the death journey of the probe at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, and I got wind of it. I badly wanted to be there because I knew that many of the participants would celebrate it with champagne, and as many I could see would go into mourning. I couldn't get approval to be there. I did manage to scramble over the wire fence outside, but was unable to get past the guards in the entrance to the control center. A physicist I think of with gratitude to this day recognized me as I was detained by the security staff and called NASA headquarters in D.C. The bigwigs were in a meeting, and the man in charge of the group was called out after I had promised not to take up more than 60 seconds of his time. I was in luck. He had seen some of my films and gave the order, "All right, let the madman in with his camera." What especially impressed me on this day was the way almost everyone was in tears, and that when they could still receive the signals from the space probe loud and clear, it was suddenly announced that the mission was over. Even though signals continued to come in, it had been calculated in advance that the probe would continue transmitting for a further 52 minutes, and that's how long the signals from the already defunct incinerated thing were underway before they reached the Earth. This experience led me to make further inquiries. In an archive, I stumbled upon some wonderful 16mm recordings that the astronauts had made during their shuttle mission. I presumed they were the only such recordings in that format, the rolls of film still sealed in their original plastic from the lab. No one had thought to do anything with them. There had of course been video recordings of the launching of the probe in 1989, and there may have been 8mm film before that, but this one crew included an astronaut with a particular interest and ability in film. The other crew members had a go with the camera, but most of the material was his. I mention this man because he had shot film of extraordinary beauty that made a deep impression on me. He had been a test pilot in all kinds of existing types of U.S. Air Force planes and had also captained a nuclear submarine. His footage, I quickly decided, together with some shots under the Antarctic ice, would form the basis for my science fiction film called The Wild Blue Yonder. Or better, it could be used to make a story out of its own properties. I wanted the shuttle astronauts to appear in the film. Yes, they were all 16 years older, but, according to my plot, they had been traveling at such extraordinary speeds that some 820 years would have gone by in Earth time. Time was warped, and they were beginning to land on a depopulated planet. It took a few months before I was able to meet them all at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. In a large hall, chairs had been set up in a semicircle, and the somewhat aged astronauts were sitting on them when I was introduced. I knew they were all distinguished scientists in their own right. Of the two female astronauts, one was a biochemist, the other a medical doctor. One of them was among the most distinguished plasma physicists in the country. All of them no-nonsense professional types. As I said hello to them, I could feel my heart sinking. How could I possibly recruit such personalities for a completely fantastical science fiction film? I told them in a few words about my origins in the Bavarian Alps and watched their expressions as I did. One of them, the pilot Michael McCulley, had clear, strong features of the kind that are familiar from westerns. As I said that, in fact, I wasn't a creature of the film industry at all, but someone who at the end of the war had learned how to milk cows, even all those years later. I start to shake when I think of the odds, but I went on to tell them that in the course of my work with actors and faces, I could often sense some of the things that lay beneath. I was, for instance, usually able to recognize people who could milk cows. I turned to Macaulay and said, "For instance, you, sir, I am willing to bet that you know how to milk a cow." He yelped and banged his thighs and started mimicking milking. Yes, indeed, Macaulay had grown up on a farm in Tennessee. I don't even want to think about the bottomless embarrassment I would have found myself in had I been wrong. But the ice was broken, and all the astronauts who appeared in the original 16mm film agreed to appear in my own movie, aged by 820 years. In Sahrang we sang, "We children learned how to tickle trout. Trout hide under stones when they sense humans, or they hang motionless underneath the overhanging grass of a riverbank. But if you reach for them cautiously with both hands and then grab them firmly, it is possible to catch them. Often, because we were so hungry, we would catch one or two in the Prien on the way to school, imprison them in shallow pools, and collect them on our way home. Mother would fry them in the pan. I can still see them freshly killed and heads off, bending in the pan. Sometimes they would even jump about. Our lives were largely spent outdoors, but Our mother wouldn't think twice about putting us out for 4 hours at a stretch, even in the depth of winter. As darkness fell, we would be standing, gibbering at the door, all of our clothes caked with snow. At precisely 5 o'clock, the door would be thrown open, and our mother would briskly sweep the snow off us with a twig broom before we were allowed inside. She thought fresh air would do us good. We had a magnificent time, especially as there were hardly any fathers anywhere in the village, so everything was in the best scene anarchic. I was certainly delighted that we didn't have a drill sergeant type in the house telling us what to do. We found ourselves without being told. I recall a calf from the Sturm farm next door, lying in the snow at the wood's edge, dead. At least 6 foxes were tugging at the body. At my approach they fled. And when my brothers circled the dead calf, another fox suddenly leaped up out of the guts, pressed itself down onto the ground, and slunk off. There's something low to the ground about foxes when they are taken by surprise. Much later, in 1982, when I was walking by myself around the periphery of Germany, I was heading into the wind along a forest path. I could suddenly smell the stink of fox, and when I turned the corner I saw one slinking right in front of me. I had almost caught up to him, walking on tiptoe, when he spun around and crouched down with his hindquarters pressed to the ground, seemingly listened for his arrested heart to begin beating again, and then ran off, still low to the ground. It was only in stag mating season that we really had to be careful. A bicyclist was set upon by a furious stag and fled under a narrow bridge, pursued by the crazed animal. It took the clashing of some empty tin cans to drive him off. There were some eerie encounters. Once in broad daylight, my brother is my witness, the whole slope behind the house was suddenly alive with weasels, all pouring down the hill in the direction of the stream. I don't think it was a dream, although it's always a possibility. We had sometimes seen the odd 1 or 2, but this must have been dozens. Lemmings are given to these mass movements, but never in my life did I hear of anything like this ascribed to weasels. A few of them fled between the logs of a woodpile, and I went looking for them, but couldn't find a single one. The surroundings were full of puzzles. On the far side of the stream, on the way to the village, there was a lofty forest of spruce, the so-called fairy forest that we were leery of going in. In a tight gorge behind the house was a waterfall with a pool partway down before it plunged into the river that was always full of clear water that was cold as ice. Occasionally tree trunks came down to it, and that gave the spot some aura of jungle. I saw Sturm Josef Sepp, we called him, bathing stark naked and rubbing himself all over with a brush made from some root. He didn't seem to be a human figure, more like an ancient wardwell overgrown with lichen blowing in the wind. Works every time.